Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is Healthy Mind Mental Health Recovery Stories, and this session is part of Be Well Day here at the University of Saskatchewan. We have breakout sessions happening all day in this room. For this session, the Schizophrenia Society of Saskatchewan's partnership program is here to share with us stories of recovery from mental illness. They have presented these stories, this program, to over 100,000 residents of Saskatchewan at this time. We have Matthew Proctor here sharing his story of recovery from schizophrenia. After that, Rick Newell will share with us his story of recovery from bipolar disorder, followed by Ryan Walker, who's going to provide a family perspective in supporting loved ones and family with severe mental illness. Following those talks, Nancy George is going to provide us with some facts about mental illness. If you could save your questions for the end, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. As well, our presenters have handouts for you at the end of the session, along with a short survey for you to fill out. So if everyone can grab some snacks, have a seat, and welcome our presenters.
Check, check. Check, check. Good? Sure.
We'll just do it. That's it. She's already done it.
All right, so hi, my name is Matt. And I'm here today to talk about my lived experience with schizophrenia, substance abuse, and recovery. I want to begin by acknowledging my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. After all my life experiences and near-fatal illnesses, if it were not for His grace, I would not be here to tell my story. On June 8th of 1996, me and 3 friends were at the Saskatchewan River. I wasn't thinking straight and decided to run down the sandbar and dive into the water. I ran about 10 feet, dove, hit the sandbar head-on, and broke the C4, C5 vertebrae in my neck. And in the first 16 years of my quadriplegia, it's been 21 years now, but in the first 16 years of my quadriplegia, I've had a staggering 38 bouts of pneumonia. And out of those 38 cases, I've been intubated on life support 8 times. I was unable to breathe on my own and felt absolutely terrified. I had double pneumonia and 2 collapsed lungs, all 8 times. They were traumatic experiences. I was on morphine for the pain and I was hallucinating. I was angry and terrified that I would die, but every time I made it through. The problem was that after every pneumonia, I would end up smoking cigarettes again, the source of the infections. These experiences caused me a lot of mental pain as well. Having schizophrenia and being so close to death so many times left me feeling damaged. It took a long time for me to heal, and I'm still in the process of healing. I was able to quit smoking 5.5 years ago, and it has greatly improved my quality of life. For 16 years, I was unable to breathe properly. I remember about 3 years after I quit, one of my fellow presenters, a doctor, commented on my breathing. It was finally normal after all those years. It's an absolute blessing to be free, and I'm very thankful. Also, being off the cigarettes allows my medications to work to 100%. So to tell you a bit about my life, it began in a small coastal town in British Columbia called Powell River. I was born on November 19th, 1971. Yeah. I was a happy, rambunctious child full of life and excitement. I enjoyed sports like hockey and baseball and other childhood games. One of my favorites was kick the bucket. Powell River was a great place to grow up. Our town was surrounded by forestry and the ocean. We did a lot of swimming in the ocean and the surrounding lakes. My family enjoyed boating and fishing, which we did on a fairly regular basis. Being in BC as a child was an amazing part of my life. When we left BC when I was 10 years old and moved here to Saskatoon, as I got older, I learned that there were problems in my family such as alcoholism, so life became difficult. I experienced a lot of fighting, yelling, swearing, and drunk driving. At this time in my life, I became a very fearful child due to the behaviors of the members of my family. I attended elementary school at John Lake for the remainder of grade 5 after we moved here from BC, and Lakeview Elementary for grade 6 to 8. I had a hard time in elementary school. I was hyperactive, and it is possible that this was the first sign of schizophrenia. It was hard for me to sit still. I was a moving target for my teachers. By grade 8, I lost interest in school and started staying home. By this time, my parents had separated, so my mom had to work all day. She was a teacher and taught at Pleasant Hill Elementary, and we lived in Lakeview, so it was near impossible for her to make sure I went to class. Life was, gotta hold it away a bit. Life was difficult for both my sister and my mom. Our dad was gone, and my mom had to teach school, care for us kids, and have a life of her own. Having a son that was angry about the divorce and began rebelling more and more wasn't easy on anyone. I blame my mom for my dad leaving. I was angry for a long time. After everything that had happened in my life as a child, my anger would prove to be a problem. I started at Walter Murray in grade 9. I was shy and awkward, as most 14-year-olds are. I liked the social part of school, but didn't seem at any time to care about the academic part. I passed grade 9, but my grades were not very good, and I could have done a lot better. I spent a year and a half at Walter Murray. In grade 9, I remember them showing us a video about a teenager that had a psychotic break on LSD. Mental illness was looked on a lot differently then. It was not as openly talked about as it is today or as accepted. I never heard of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any of the mental health issues. The teenager in the film thought he was Superman and had his powers. It was a definite warning about drugs. Years later, I would have forgotten that film and be abusing on my own. It started at 17 years of age and ended up about 6.5 years ago that I stopped. When I was in grade 10, I decided to get a key cut to my mom's Audi sports car and take my friends joyriding. I would skip school and drive around all day. It was dangerous. It was a fast car, and I had no license or driving experience, but somehow I managed to go unharmed. I was fortunate not to get caught, but that would change. This carelessness and throwing caution to the wind could have been a telltale sign of the beginning symptoms of schizophrenia. I was only 15, so I had not started the drinking and drugs yet, but that would come later. In the summer of that same year, my mom, Bill, and my sister were going on a trip for 2 weeks. They planned to take the Audi. Instead, I disabled the motor. When they couldn't get the car going, they ended up taking Bill's car. Half an hour after they left, I refastened the plug. We jump-started the motor and cruised around for the full 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, we had no money for gas, so what do? We were siphoning from cars in our neighborhood. We didn't get caught, but it was another really stupid decision. At the end, I would end up getting caught and end up being arrested and held downtown in the detention cells. My mom was trying to show me tough love. I was there for 2 days until I was released into my grandfather's custody. After going to court, I was sent to Elrose, Saskatchewan to live with my dad, where I lived for 4 months. I didn't fit in and soon had more enemies than friends. It is also where I drank my first 6-pack of beer. I got ill, but that didn't stop me. That is when my road of substance abuse began. My doctor told my mom he believes the illness came first and everything else was self-medicating. After 4 months, I moved back to Saskatoon and began attending aid in Bowman. I met a lot of people at Bowman and made a lot of friends. We partied a lot, and I soon started smoking marijuana. I liked it because it made me laugh. The marijuana and other drugs I abused would also go on to induce my schizophrenia and the pain I felt for so many years. I wasn't attending class regularly or doing assignments, and was really disruptive in class. I had a bad attitude and a smart mouth, so I didn't last long at Bowman. Soon after being kicked out of Bowman, 2 friends and I moved to Lake Louise, Alberta, to work at the Post Hotel. I kept in touch with my family, but we were not on good terms, especially with my mother and my grandmother. My drug abuse became every day, all day. We partied hard for 3 months and moved back to Saskatoon. Then after I had started abusing LSD and mushrooms on a regular basis, and including all the other drugs, marijuana and hash and oil. At the age of 19, everything in my life would come crashing down around me. I had my first psychotic break. I remember feeling exposed, naked, and paranoid. I felt guilt and fear, but it was really intensified. This may sound strange, but I felt disconnected from my body. This sensation would last a long time, and it would take 20 years before I would finally recover from the onslaught of voices and delusions that controlled my life. My life changed drastically at this point. I moved home, but rapidly grew worse. One day, I just started to sense something in the back of my mind. I may have passed off my first break from reality to the drugs I took, but this feeling I was having made me feel a great sense of uneasiness. At this time, my mom moved me into a basement suite. I was around a lot of my old friends and abusing again. I had been off the drugs and alcohol for 3 months. It was at the age of 20 that I would lose touch from reality almost completely. I began having constant hallucinations and delusions. I was receiving messages from the TV and the music I was listening to, I thought. I listened to a lot of heavy metal and the messages were quite disturbing. The music had never bothered me in my teenage years, but now lyrics about the devil and other dark images on top of my illness began to lead me down a dark path. I became highly paranoid and fearful. I felt tormented, and that wasn't too far from the truth. I still didn't know I had an illness. I just knew I had become lost, and my mind was full of chaos. I was truly terrified. About this time, I was arrested for warrants on unpaid tickets, and due to my mental state, I was placed in a psychiatric cell at the correctional center to be examined by a doctor who then had me admitted to the Hampton Psychiatric Unit. I was given antipsychotic medication and stabilized. I had a hard time with the side effects. I felt lethargic and sick to my stomach and almost comatose. Lockup in the Hampton was scary. I was placed in the basement, locked up in a room surrounded by strangers who were suffering from mental illnesses. It felt like I was in jail. What made matters worse was I was feeling very ill due to the psychotic drugs I had been given for the first time. My time at the Hampton was an intense and an overwhelming experience. Even though I've never been there, today the Dubé Center is a far, far better hospital. I was living in mental health group homes from the age of 20 to 24 and was admitted to the hospital 12 times in those 4 years. But I was given many freedoms. I was allowed a lot of passes out for the day. In one of my later admissions, I don't remember why, but I was in lockdown and did not want to be there, so I asked to go to the yard for a smoke. As soon as I got outside, I ran and hopped the fence and ran down to the river. I saw some people I knew. All I could think about was escaping, so they took me to the Grasswood Esso. Now, major delusion, I was convinced that God was telling me to go tell a friend about Jesus and that angels would lead me to him. And he led me all the way to Whistler, British Columbia. I can't really remember how long it took me to get to Whistler. 2 or 3 days of walking and hitchhiking, but I made it. I didn't find the person I thought God had sent me to find because it was not real. I was only there one day and one night. I wandered around all day aimlessly. The night came and I had nowhere to stay, so I walked into the forest and slept on the forest floor. Sorry. It felt like a huge blanket of protection covered me. I was asleep instantly. I'm glad there were no hungry bears or other animals that might have been on the menu. I woke up early the next morning and I walked back to the village. I started to understand the gravity of my situation. I was 2 provinces away from home, with no food, money, or ID. I asked how to get out of town and started down a street with some cabins. I happened to pass a cabin with 3 mountain bikes outside. So believe it or not, I stole one and left Whistler. It took me about 16 hours and without food or water, but I rode from Whistler to Vancouver on the mountain bike. Possibly one of the most challenging and stupid things I have ever done. I made it to the bus station in Vancouver and phoned my mom. She paid for a ticket and I loaded my new bike on the bus. I think I slept almost all the way home. I got into Saskatoon and my mom was waiting for me to take me to the hospital. Mom had never known how severe my illness was until that day. I was speaking loudly and angrily to the voices. My mom then realized that this was real. Having a mental illness like schizophrenia has been unbelievably challenging, and at times I have fallen into darkness and deep sorrow. There is incredibly always hope and light present to help me find my way out. My relationship with my family and friends are a lot stronger and healthier. Schizophrenia is treatable, but there is no cure. There is remission and or recovery. You can manage your symptoms and live a full life. You master the illness so that it will no longer master you. Is it a day-to-day struggle? Yes, it sure is, but I feel comfortable, I feel confident in how I feel right now and how I am in control of my illness. There is victory and there is hope. I want you to see that people with mental illnesses are human beings. They are not stigmas and labels. We are equal, especially in God's eyes, and He is our Creator. We may be different, but we are intelligent and diverse and strong. Thank you very much for listening.
Very good, Nick.
Thank you.
I'm over here. Can you hear me okay back there? I guess so. Good afternoon. My name is Rick. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about myself, my mental illness. For the record, I have bipolar 2 and general anxiety disorders. A little bit about me. I am from Newfoundland. Has nothing to do with being mentally ill. I grew up in a small sea-coastal town on the southeast part of the island. I come from a family of 7 children, and I am the third oldest. We were raised in a very small 3-bedroom bungalow, and I can honestly say we were a close family. That'll take a while. My mother, she was the heart of the family. She looked after her children with the nurturing and love that only a loving mother can give. But she lived a troubled life. She had depression and she had schizophrenia. Medication and shock treatments helped, but they left her lethargic, dull-minded, and sadly, over time, she lost her great sense of humor and her zest for life. Towards her latter part of life, she never complained. She instead chose to live in silence and suffer alone until she passed away. My father was a blue-collar worker. He did well to provide for his family, but he was a strict parent with a quick and mean temper. He demanded complete obedience from his family. Anything less, you were subject to getting cursed at or hit. His only 2 interests in life was drinking and gambling. Hardly a week went by that he was not intoxicated. But from my perspective, intoxicated or sober, he was physically, verbally, and emotionally abusive. My siblings and I, we lived in absolute fear of him. Now, poor money management, alcohol abuse, and gambling were the cause of many conflicts between my parents. The more serious conflicts happened at nighttime. I remember being suddenly awakened to the loud sounds of my angry and drunken father cursing at and hitting my mother. During these violent times, I'd lay in bed, curled up in a ball. My hands were clenched tightly and my nerves were on high alert. I wanted to protect my mother and hurt my father badly, but I simply couldn't. It was painful for me to hear my mother's screams and pleas for help, for there was nothing I could do. The next day, I was deeply bothered and saddened to see my mother hurt, in pain, and demoralized. Invariably, within a few days, my father would be sorry, apologetic, and then they would reconcile and be happy again. But within a few days from that, the arguments would start and the cycle of violence would start all over again. Like my siblings, we all suffered in silence. We never talked about our parents and the dysfunctional upbringing we endured until many, many years later. In junior high school, I had a hard time to behave properly. It was difficult for me to sit still in my desk and pay attention to the teachers. Because of my restless energies and disruptive ways, I was sometimes punished. I was hit on my hands with either a rawhide strap or a long wooden ruler. Now, it hurt me to be physically punished, but it also hurt me more to be punished in front of my classmates. Needless to say, I had low self-esteem and confidence. After I completed high school, I joined the Canadian Armed Forces. I was very proud to wear the Air Force uniform. I did my recruit training in Nova Scotia, and from there I went to Ottawa to be trained as a special communications specialist. And I worked in a military intelligence organization for 25 years. And I'm very proud to say I'm a military veteran. In the mid-70s, I was stationed in Newfoundland. It was there that I met a beautiful woman from Saskatoon. We met in St. John's and we got married there. As a new military family, we traveled to and lived in many places in Canada and the United States. While we were living in Ottawa, we adopted a beautiful baby girl, our one and only child. Now, in the early years of our marriage, everything was going very well. My wife and I were very happy. My moods and behaviors were positive and they were under control. Then, for some unexplained reason or reasons, and unknown to me, my thinking gradually became distorted and my behaviors overly compulsive. They were irrational and extremely hard to control. Many times I said or did things that were inappropriate. They were wrong and often immoral. I did and said things that I regret to this very day. Being manic for me is like being on a roller coaster ride. There are the high speeds, dizzying heights, the sudden lows, and an adrenaline that is hard to control. But during my mania, I never thought I had any mental health issues. After all, I was happy and I was full of life. I was also very successful and productive at my work and in playing sports. I earned promotions, I received military medals, and I won many sports awards. I had a lot of pride. But unfortunately, success went to my head. My attitude changed. I became self-centered and arrogant. Now, being manic had its troubling side. I was a risk taker. I took chances that seriously jeopardized my marriage and my career. I drove carelessly and often under the influence of alcohol. I drank excessively and I gambled away a lot of my money. I had many indiscretions. I criticized and quarreled with my friends and my coworkers. I was adamant that they did not understand me. I was always right, so I thought. I did have depressive moods. Sometimes someone would say or do something that would suddenly trigger my anxieties and my emotions. Then I'd become nervous, anxious, and at times very reclusive. These low moods did not last long, maybe a few days, but they were repetitive and they were intense. As a communications specialist in the forces, this is a little bit about my military career. I completed 6 tours of duty in the high Arctic at a base called Alert. Alert is known as the world's most northerly habitat. It's about 800 miles or kilometers from the North Pole. There are 2 seasons there, light and dark. Now, living in isolation over a period of time was psychologically and emotionally stressing for me. In 1993, a military transport plane crashed in Alert. There were 18 survivors and there was 5 people who perished. During the recovery operation, it was extremely hard for me to cope with the events. I was never the same after that tragedy. Shortly after it, I did retire from the forces. After I retired, my family and I moved to Saskatoon from Kingston, Ontario. At the time, I believed that moving to Saskatoon was going to be a great opportunity for me to leave my troubles, dark secrets behind, and start a new life. But moving here did not work out the way I envisioned. I quickly discovered that the grass was not at all greener here. I didn't find a job right away. I didn't know my way around the city. I had no friends. I didn't know what to do. I was worried and scared and angry at myself for the way my life was unfolding. For me, the future looked very grim. More drinking and gambling did nothing to make me feel better, only made matters worse. Now in high school, my beautiful young teenage daughter, her attitude changed completely. She became very rebellious. She went from being an A student to getting very low marks. She had a high rate of absenteeism. In grade 12 and on her own, she quit school and moved in with a guy who is 14 years older than her. They were heavily involved with alcohol and street drugs. My wife and I were devastated. For me, this was the lowest point in my life. It wasn't long before my daughter and her partner had a baby. Now, I should have been happy to be a grandfather for the first time, but I wasn't. I was very worried for them. They had little resources to look after themselves, let alone a new baby. One day, I went to the mall to see my daughter and my grandson. When I first saw them, something triggered my nerves and fears. I didn't know what was happening to me. I couldn't breathe properly. I was scared and nervous. I knew instinctively that I needed to get outside the mall and get some fresh air. And once I did, my breathing and nerves calmed down. I felt better, but I was still in a state of shock. This anxiety or panic attack was immediately followed by a major depression for me. I had physical aches and pains, for which my doctor had no answers, just lots of medications. My mind was in a dark, quiet place. I had very little energy. I slept throughout the night and throughout most of the day, for I felt very hopeless. And for the first time in many years, I was emotional. After about 6 weeks of being severely depressed, I went to my doctor and asked for help. He prescribed me an antidepressant. At first I was very angry at this, and I was in denial that I had any mental health problems. Plus I also had very little faith that this tiny pill would do me any good. But I was surprised that in a few weeks I began to feel better. As a matter of fact, I felt so good I quit taking my medication. I believed I was cured. It didn't take long before the signs and symptoms of my depression started to come back, and that really scared me. My doctor was not at all impressed with me. He told me never to stop taking meds without first talking to him. I now take my meds every day as prescribed. Now that my depression was under control, I felt better, but I was still struggling with the manic phase of my life. I continued to have strong, compulsive behaviors and urges. My mind and body was in a turmoil. I was out of control and afraid of what was happening to me. In a last-ditch attempt to save myself and my marriage, I went back to my family doctor and I asked for more help. I was referred to a psychiatrist, and after several interviews, I was diagnosed with having bipolar II and general anxiety disorders. The year was 2008, the year that my recovery journey began. My recovery is doing well. I have regular checkups with my doctors. I take my medications, but there are some side effects like weight gain, hand tremors, but the positive benefits outweigh the negative ones. For me, education is key, because education about mental illness is enlightening and empowering for me. I am confident. I feel less intimidated, more understanding of who I am. My own self-stigma is non-existent now. I am presently in the midst of having some minor relapses with my health. I now have an appointment to see my doctor very soon. I believe in giving back to the mental health community. I am a peer support worker. I work with people who have lived experience with mental illness and who are wanting help themselves or support to achieve their own recovery. I have personally experienced stigma. When I first mentioned my mental illness to my siblings and a few close friends, I was met with disbelief, a few kind words of understanding, and then absolute silence. I felt like I said something wrong, and maybe that I should apologize. On the other side of my life, I have cardiovascular disease. For the record, I have 6 stents. And when I mention this to my friends and siblings, I get a lot of support and encouragement. Stigma about mental illness is discriminating, it's hurtful, it is wrong. I believe that with more education and public awareness and better mental health facilities, stigma will be greatly reduced, and one day it will be a non-issue. For me, there's always hope for the future. Now, hope is my lighthouse. And being the good Newfoundlander that I am, I know that hope will guide me safely as I sail across the ocean on my own recovery journey. I shall never lose hope. And yes, the grass is a lot greener here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ryan Walker, and can you hear me okay? Yep. And my story pertains mostly to my experience as really to my experience as a family member, talking mostly about my mother. And thank you all for coming. It's nice to see so many people here. My mother's always been an excellent parent and caring parent to me and my little sister. But when we were quite young, my parents divorced, and I was 7 years old, and my mom needed to transition at that time from being sort of a house mother to doing that, taking care of us, as well as earning money to support us. And so she enrolled in night classes to pursue a certified management accountant designation and worked full-time during the day in order to earn money to support us. And I remember her life being very challenging, tiring, and lonely for her. That's kind of the memory I have of that time for her. And when I was around 11 or 12 years old, my mother began to act very differently. And she'd take me to the back window of our townhouse in St. Albert, Alberta, and point to a car that had been parked for weeks in the same visitor parking spot, and tell me that the car was hooked up with equipment to monitor her and our home. And she told me that she had receivers planted throughout her body by our dentist and doctors who she believed were part of a conspiracy to monitor her. She'd come home and tell me and my sister that people were following her in the grocery store. She'd wear long coats and dark glasses to disguise herself in public. And we'd stay for weeks at a time at my grandparents' house, where my mother would try to recover from paranoia, anxiety, and depression. And luckily, my grandparents lived in the same city as us. She would bounce back for a little while, and we'd go back to our townhouse. And then before long, we'd end up back at my grandparents' place while my mother battled with symptoms that we would later learn were caused by schizophrenia. So nobody in our family really had any idea about mental illness or schizophrenia in particular, and oftentimes the family would believe her delusions, and we kids always believed them. And her parents and brothers would do things to help out that they thought, were really happening. They'd investigate things that, like the parked car behind the house and so forth, try and figure out what was going on. And she was diagnosed with schizophrenia in her early 30s. And once she started seeing her psychiatrist and taking medication, her life and the lives of our family improved a lot. My mother had her mind back and resumed her night courses, and she graduated. She remarried. She became an accomplished accountant working for the firm that's now called Deloitte. And then she ended up moving on to become a finance manager of the Glenrose Hospital in Edmonton. She became a tireless advocate for people with schizophrenia like herself, and eventually became the executive director of the Schizophrenia Society of Alberta, a job she held for most of the 90s. Part of what she did there was started a group for people with schizophrenia in Edmonton called Unsung Heroes, and led the development of a clubhouse that was run by people with schizophrenia where they could work and socialize. The Minister of Health appointed her to the Alberta Mental Health Board that guided decision-making in the province, and she also tried to start a group home outside of Edmonton. But pressure from local people who were ignorant about schizophrenia and who bought into the stigma that people with the illness were violent came out in large numbers to protest the approval of the home. And I remember helping my mother respond to resident concerns at that time, which I remember thinking were really shocking. The local council ended up siding with the fearful residents and didn't approve the project as a result. But overall, my mother's mental health was good, and she was enjoying her career and her life, and she moved on from that, not starting the group home. She was optimistic about the future, but side effects of taking the antipsychotic medication, and especially the weight gain, had been getting her down for many years, affecting her self-esteem. It finally got to a point where she stopped taking her medication without telling her psychiatrist or family, and it was about 6 months before she told us, and none of us could change her mind. I was getting ready to move to New Zealand for a job as a university professor there, and I was worried about the times ahead for my mother. Unfortunately, schizophrenia doesn't give up, and throughout her life wrestling with it, sometimes the illness would win. Just over a year after I moved to New Zealand, I received a phone call from my grandparents telling me that my mother had left her apartment in St. Albert and driven away in her car with her dog, and she'd never returned there, and she basically left it for our family to pack up and sell in her absence. She spent over a year away, most of the time homeless, having fled her home in St. Albert after having stopped taking her medication, she had come to believe that the government of Alberta, aided by my grandfather, her father, and one of her brothers, was trying to catch her, hospitalize her, and ultimately kill her. She believed that I and many others were actually clones, which she saw as innocent victims. And the sort of, quote, real me had been abducted by the Alberta government and my grandfather and uncle. She believed that my real sister was being held prisoner in her own basement and essentially being starved to death, and that a clone of her was living her life upstairs. So if you put yourself in that sort of frame of mind, it must have been terrifying and awful to be a mother who believed sincerely that her children were in such danger. And so one of her goals when she abandoned her home and left was to go to the White House in Washington, D.C. and speak to the then President, George W. Bush, to ask him to send in the American military to stop the Alberta government from carrying out its plot. My mother believed that my great-grandmother was Anastasia, a daughter of the last Tsar of Russia, and that our family was descended from royal bloodlines. And we're really not, by the way, although I wish we were. This tie to royalty was what she felt would get her access to see President Bush at the White House. She ended up staying at a homeless shelter in Toronto for a while before heading to Washington, and it was enough time for me to work with an ex-girlfriend there who was a lawyer to get an order from a Justice of the Peace under the Ontario Mental Health Act, which would enable the Toronto police to take my mother to a psychiatric facility on account of her being a harm to herself or to other people. And the order came one day too late, and when police went to enforce it, she had already left early that morning for Washington. The next day, she went to the White House, as she had intended to do, and managed to get near enough to the President's office that the Secret Service stopped her with their pistols drawn. And after she told them why she was there trying to see him, they understood that this lovely woman needed psychiatric help and took her to a hospital and gave us a call. She was admitted to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington and spent quite a while there under psychiatric care, and we wanted to take her back home for treatment in Edmonton, but she didn't want to come home. She was still afraid of Alberta and Edmonton. After being discharged, my mother lived homeless in Washington for a few months, no longer on medication or in the care of a psychiatrist, and something happened to her, and I still don't know what it was to this day, that frightened her and caused her to accept a plane ticket home to Edmonton. Before long, after a short time in hospital, she made her way back to Toronto, where she was homeless again for a while before eventually getting a room in a boarding house. And she wouldn't give us anyone her address, and she had no phone, so communication was difficult. I'd occasionally get a letter or a collect call from her, but no return address. And one thing I remember my mother often mentioning was that she made good friends with other homeless people in Washington and Toronto, and that they protected and took good care of one another. At the end of May 2007, about 6 months after I took up my current job as a professor here at the University of Saskatchewan, my mother finally told me where she was staying in Toronto by writing me a letter. I flew to Toronto, and we went with her. Her and I went to the airport and got on a flight home, and she was met at the Edmonton airport by family and taken directly to her psychiatrist of 20 years and admitted to psychiatric care. She spent a long time at Alberta Hospital getting healthy after that, and since she returned to Edmonton in 2007, my sister had a baby boy, my mother's first grandchild, and my mother really has been the best grandmother a person could have. I could imagine having. She's been great. After returning to Edmonton, my sister, in her late 20s at the time, became ill with what was diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder. And so my mother and sister were both taking medication to manage the symptoms of mental illness, and were really taking care of each other and my nephew on weekends, and I think they did a great job of it. So my mom, while having schizophrenia, was a great role model to me and to so many people in Alberta. I'm proud of her strength and conviction. People with schizophrenia really are unsung heroes, as my mom had named that support group in Edmonton. And they teach us the full range of human capacity for moving from adversity to triumph over one of the ultimate challenges in life, an unrelenting illness of the mind. I'm optimistic that she'll live a good quality of life if she continues with her medication and her psychiatrist, and that she'll continue to be an excellent grandmother to her grandson and a mother to me, and enjoy the company of her friends to the fullest. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nancy George, and I work with the Saskatoon Housing Coalition and volunteer with the partnership program to help fight the stigma that's out there regarding mental illness. I'm going to talk a little bit about several of the illnesses that people can get and give you a few facts on those. Schizophrenia affects about 1% of the population. So in a city about the size of Saskatoon, that's 2,500 people. In Saskatchewan, that would be 10,000. With bipolar illness, it affects 1.2% of the population. So that's about 3,000 people in Saskatoon. And with schizoaffective disorder, it affects 1 in 500. So there's about 6,000 people in Saskatoon that are diagnosed with mental illness of those 3 forms. And there's many other forms. There's anxiety disorders and personality disorders and lots more. So it's not a small thing. It is a very large thing, although we don't hear a lot about it. The Schizophrenia Society can be very proud of the fact that they have really made an effort and gotten mental illness into the news, into everybody's life. We all talk about it. We all know what it is now, and it's not hidden. We don't hide people away in institutions anymore. Mental illness affects both men and women. However, with some illnesses, they say that the female hormone estrogen will protect a woman a little bit longer. So schizophrenia will start in the early teen years to 20s for men, and usually a little bit later than that for women. So what's happening in that time for kids? When you're thinking they're just starting into high school, they've just gone from being a senior in their junior years, and they're now, in their last school, and the new school, they're now the juniors there, or they went from being seniors to going back to juniors again. So when you start high school, what do you want? You want friends, you want to belong, you want to have a group. So if you're starting to experience things like hallucinations or voices, are you going to tell anybody? Not likely. You don't want that. You'll be ostracized and people won't come near you. So it's really difficult to get people to actually talk about it when they're first starting to experience their illnesses. But it is so important because the recovery is much better outcomes when people do get help faster. So the kind of things that someone with schizophrenia would experience are hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, thought disorder, personality changes, depression, social withdrawal, functional deterioration, cognitive problems, and they can have any one of those or any number of those. Everybody with schizophrenia does not experience the same thing. They all react differently to their medications. Everybody is unique, everybody is individual. And it's really difficult to try and put everybody into one cup. Violence, I know when I talk to younger people, I always put that up on the board, a big violence, and who thinks there's more violence in the mental health population. Actually, it's either lower or equal to the rest of the population. People with mental illness are not prone to violence. They generally are the victim of violence. They're not the perpetrators. However, when you see the news and something big comes up, or movies, and all the medias used to really emphasize, if there was someone in the crowd that had a mental illness, they were always pointed out, or it was always said that was there. Whereas if you have heart disease or diabetes, nobody mentions that. So why would it be different? It takes about 6 months to get a psychiatric diagnosis, and that's to make sure that the symptoms are still there, that they're actually not a result of a drug-induced psychosis. And again, with early intervention, there's better outcomes. There's many theories around schizophrenia, but what we do know is that it you must have a predisposition. Somewhere in your family line, there must be someone who has schizophrenia for you to be able to get the illness. There are many theories around viral conditions that cause schizophrenia, birth trauma, and early childhood infections. But again, much more studies have to be done to get a better idea. Right now, like, there's no blood test that you can take that says you have schizophrenia or that you have bipolar illness. They can test your medication to see if it's working, but they can't test your illness. So that makes it really difficult. It makes it really important that when you have a psychiatrist, that you tell the psychiatrist what exactly you're experiencing. Because I tell the younger folks that you can go to 4 different psychiatrists and get 4 different diagnoses depending on what you tell them. So it's really important, if you want to get on with your life and recovery, that you are honest and able to discuss that with your doctor. Bipolar illness is, I always describe it as the fluctuation in a day. We all experience that. In the morning, you get up, somebody made your favorite breakfast, you feel really good about that. You know, you go out the door and it starts to pour. Well, you kind of feel miserable about that. You're off to work or school and you're sort of on a plateau. You get to class or work and somebody's got a big job or a task for your test or something, and that sort of brings most people down, some people up. But all day it's sort of like that. With a person with the bipolar illness, their day is more like this. Their swings are higher and lower. There may be no explanation as for why they're experiencing it. Just happens. Some people have a rapid thing where one minute they're laughing, the next minute they're crying, and then they're laughing, and then they're crying, and just constant like that. Other people, you can go for months with the depression, or you can go for a period of time with the mania part of it, where you'll do things that you wouldn't normally do when you were well. People with mania have the cleanest houses around. They're great cooks and they're always baking and they don't sleep, and then all of a sudden they crash. People with depression that is really severe have a hard time even getting out of bed. They just want to stay there. They don't have any ambition. They have no desire to do anything but just be. How do we treat these illnesses? Oh, I'll tell you a little bit about schizoaffective too. Schizoaffective is one in every 500 people, and it's sort of a, you get the symptoms of schizophrenia and bipolar. Oh joy, you get all of it. But I do believe that it's under the emotional side in the DSM, the book that tells you what the different disorders are. That's in my history. I've been in this field for about 35 years, and in my history, that was never mentioned 35 years ago. That's come up more in the last 15, 20 years. So how is mental illness treated? Medications. However, with medications, there are side effects, and if you're having bad side effects, do you want to take the medication that they're giving you? That's why it's really important to discuss with your doctor what the side effects are and whether you can deal with it. You know, if you're going to gain 50 pounds in 3 months with this medication, how many people want to take that med? Some people will if it takes away the symptoms of their illness. Most people don't want to gain 50 pounds. Similarly, if it affects your sexual life, a lot of times it'll put a damper on that. Most people don't want that. There wouldn't be an option for them. Other people may not care if it takes away the symptoms of their illness. And then you get all the other things with general kind of things. You may get dry mouth, you may have blurred vision, you may get all those kind of things that we see on other medications that we take. There's also psychiatric help, counseling. There's lifestyle changes that people can make, mental health and social supports, and alternative therapies. With alternative therapies, I always tell people to make sure that they do it in combination with their doctor, so that there is someone who has a medical background that can see where the changes are coming. The cost, deinstitutionalization happened in about the 65-ish. And the healthcare dollars made up of the healthcare dollars, 66% went to psychiatry, and that was in 1965. In 1990, less than 3%. So you have a pie, 2/3 of it of that pie dollars went to psychiatry in 65. Less than 3%, which is a tiny, tiny little slice of that pie, goes to psychiatry now. And when you take a look at the medical field, we're doing lots of great things there too. So I don't want to knock that, but psychiatry always gets they always call it the second-class citizen, or the poorer relative, or whatever. So that's where lots of community-based organizations like I work for develop, so that we can help people, and it doesn't cost the government as much. For a hospital bed, schizophrenia costs more than any other condition to keep a person in hospital. The second highest is a car accident. 45% of people with schizophrenia will attempt suicide. 10 to 15% of those people will lose their lives. For every person, just kind of gives you an idea of how prevalent mental illness is. For every person with muscular dystrophy, there are 60 people with schizophrenia. For every person with multiple sclerosis, which is very high in Saskatchewan, 5 people have mental illness. And for any person with a diabetic-related illness, there are 6 people with schizophrenia. So it is not uncommon. It is very common. We probably all know people that have the disease, and some people are able to control it well with medications, and that takes a long time, learning what works and what doesn't work for you. But in my experience with the Housing Coalition, I've seen people referring themselves as mental health patients. I can't do that. I'm a mental health patient. To people who are now living in the community, they're getting their said money from the government, and they're spending it like everyone else. They're buying their groceries, they've got friends, they're happy, some of them have pets, and it is so wonderful to see. They have so much to offer us. There's not a day that I go to work that I don't come away having learned something from them. And with that, I want to leave time so that we have time for questions. These guys have been asked everything and anything, so if anything is on your mind, please feel free to ask the questions. Thank you. Be careful, because if you don't ask the questions, these guys will.
Oh, there's one at the front there.
Hello? Yeah, I think about it all the time. About why me, why did this happen, all that stuff. But once you accept it, you can kind of move on though, right? You can realize, I have this illness, and this illness doesn't define who I am. It's just a small part of me, and, it's something I have to live with. I have to take my medication. But I can still have a good life. I can still, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Not really?
For myself there, when I was diagnosed, I went to psychologist counseling for about 2 years. That helped me a lot to understand myself, put me right back in perspective. I'm sorry. I'm just saying that when I was diagnosed with my illness, I went to, as part of my therapy, other than medication, went to a psychologist for counseling. And I think I went for about 2 years. And that did tremendous for my well-being. And for a couple of reasons, that broke the barrier because I never believed in psychologists, psychiatrists, or anything like that. So I had to overcome a lot of that self-stigma type attitude. And once I opened those doors, then I was able to see and understand and get educated and get to know myself. Because once I was diagnosed, my life changed a total new direction. I couldn't carry on the same way before. So once you understand where you are and who you are, then the journey gets a little bit easier. I hope that helps you a bit. Yes? I don't know what the alternative is to medication, but whatever you probably want to do or find out is talk to your family doctor or psychiatrist or some professional and see what it does for your health and well-being, as opposed to just doing it on yourself like naturopath or homeo or whatever. It's so important that the medication, I'm a firm believer in it, because it's the brain, it's the organ of the brain that is at fault. It has neurotransmitters, it has synapses, and it has dopamine, serotonin. These are all chemicals in the brain that are malfunctioning. Chemicals in medications help to treat them, to help them to work and get back on track. And that's why medications are so important. So if you can find another source, or I really can't say. I'll just say a couple of words before I can pass it over. Schizophrenia is not, I don't believe, is strictly connected to family genetic. There could be other factors that can induce schizophrenia. And I think Nancy mentioned several of them that are like viral or accidental or whichever, drugs, etc. There's a host of things that come into play. So, and situational depression, there is, as far as I understand, very much so. There could be a situation of death or loss, or there's something that's happening, and you could be depressed for that period of time and come back out and be okay. I'm not an expert, but that's the best I can offer.
Okay, I'm not sure. I didn't catch the first part of that. But generally, they say with schizophrenia, there has to be a genetic component someplace in there that can be brought out if you, one of the things is drugs, marijuana smoking. Many people think there is nothing wrong with marijuana, but if you have a predisposition for a mental illness, the last thing you want to do is to smoke marijuana. There are good uses for medical uses for marijuana, but smoking it is not one of them. The people that I know that do smoke marijuana and have schizophrenia and have a paranoid schizophrenia will see an increase in their paranoia until they are so incapable of living independently they have to go to hospital, and then they come out, they start the cycle all over again. And it is just a cyclical thing. But the other things, the viral and all that kind of things, there are studies that are done that say that that has been a component. I also presented with a woman who said there was nowhere in her family could they find schizophrenia, but she had a terribly difficult birth with her son. And she believes that's where it was, and there is some evidence for that as well. But generally, they're saying the genetic component is the most dominant thing. And how that gets brought out is through, it can be through trauma, through drug use, stress, and that can bring it on. They say with kids, the earlier they start smoking marijuana, it'll bring if they have a propensity for schizophrenia, they will have the onset sooner than they would have had they not. So does that answer what you were asking? Okay.
Yeah, my name is Wayne. I'm from Newfoundland as well. I'm full of that ADHD. That might have something to do with where we come from. I got a question about the schizophrenia. One of my friends, he committed suicide. Well, he acted on suicide because of some reasons, I guess, you know what I mean? But for me to better understand it, like, where do the voices come from? Is it from your own mental thoughts? Is it like a different voice coming from your head, from TVs? Because he actually burnt down his parents' house saying that the TV told him to do so, you know? So is it your own mental saying to do it, or is it like some voice that you never heard before telling you?
I think it's both, a bit of both. Where would you say the voices come from? I don't know, sometimes you can have a delusion about the TV or music talking to you, and hallucinate that way in here, like think like they're giving you messages. Other times, I guess it could be your own thoughts. You know, you gotta learn, you know, I don't know, you gotta learn how to kind of tell the difference, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
One of the ways I try to understand people with schizophrenia is they're having a dream that we would normally have at night when we're sleeping any time of the day. So it could be a bad dream or it could be a good dream. Those voices, where do they come from in your head when you're sleeping? I don't know, but they're there. They can believe that the radio is talking specifically to them, or the TV. This fellow that I said was really paranoid used to turn his computer down, his television down, anything that had a screen on it, because he thought people could see him. So there is no particular thing, no way, but I know that other people have done things where in your past you've learned things, and you've learned them from someone. And if you pay attention to that, like if you go into therapy and you start working on that, you can eventually identify the voice and the person that told you that. And that's where you develop that behavior from. But with schizophrenia, it's not necessarily just from a behavior. It's a chemical thing that goes on in the brain, and it causes the disruptions.
I just want to add a little tidbit to my fellow Newfoundlander. Not many of us here, is there? One thing about the voices, and the sounds that people with schizophrenia hear. The worst thing I think you can say to that person, it's in your mind. It's not. Those things are real. They are very real. And the best you can do with someone who's saying that is listen. And they say you're okay, and comfort them, whatever, because those voices and those things are all real for that person.
I'll just add very briefly that in my mother's case, for example, there were no voices. So voices aren't a universal component. In her case, it was thoughts that she believed to be perfectly rational. Yep. No, yeah, go ahead.
Addictions is, for me, a hard thing to relate to, but I certainly relate to everything you just said because I experienced very similar things with my highs and my lows and my relapses, which I'm going through at the moment as we speak because I'm struggling with some things. But as far as handling it and how to treat it, one of the programs I did through the McCarricker Center, where they do a lot of education and drop-in centers for people with mental illness, is they do a program there. It's called WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And that's a program where they help you to understand yourself and what to do for yourself when you have in crisis situations where you're not doing very well, and who you are and how you're doing living with your mental illness. And at the end of it, you'll build your own so-called wellness box with your tools in there that you make up, that you want to help you when you've got a situation to help you to get over that hurdle or that moment in time. So you basically are working with yourself to know yourself. That should help a bit.
We're seeing more and more of the addictions mixed in with mental illness, and that's why we have mental health and addictions now. But it is still, no matter who it is, when you have an addiction, it is really difficult to be able to stay clean of that behavior that you're doing. And again, with the WRAP program, or the WRAP, the plan, that helps you because you develop this plan while you're well, and you know what kind of things are your go-to for being well, and you know the things that tip you over the edge. So you start to avoid those, and what are the supports that you have in place. And the WRAP plan, you can carry it in your wallet, and you can always open it up and look at it when you need to. It's just a lot of hard work, and thrown in with the mental illness on top of it, doubly hard, because you don't want either to flare. And I come from Scotland, and I was supposed to be from Mary, Queen of Scots, and we were kicked out of Scotland for stealing sheep. Just had to say that. Wow. Yes, I was pulling the wool over your eyes. Good questions.
Well, thank you again, Matthew, Rick, and Ryan, for sharing your stories with us today and all the work that you do, helping to end stigma against mental illness and also encouraging treatment options. And big thanks to Nancy as well for facilitating this and sharing some facts with us. We have some small thank you gifts for all four of you for participating with us today. Thanks, Christina. We really appreciate you being part of Be Well Day here at the university.